This
Jamie,
conference will now be recorded.
and I just want to let people know that was Jamie Copsey that introduced this, although your screen may say Phil Miller. Um, but Jamie is leading our training and webinar series. I'm Kathy Traylor-Holzer. I'm a Senior Program Officer for the IUCN SSC Conservation Planning Specialist Group. Our offices are here in the United States in near Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm going to present this webinar in concert with Christine Luce, who works with the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums, our CPSG Europe office, and also Copenhagen Zoo. And she'll be doing another version of this webinar in a couple of days in a different time slot. So people around the world will have a chance to listen to this. Both Christine and I have a XC2 population management background, as well as species conservation planning and facilitation, population modeling expertise. And she and I worked with Phil McGowan as the small drafting group that helped draft the IUCN guidelines that we'll talk about today for XC2 management. In my talk today, I'd like to cover three things, basically. One is to explain how and why XC2 management can and might contribute to the conservation of species. Also to go through a tool that's been developed, the IUCN Guidelines for the use of XC2 management for species conservation, and walk you through the decision process in those guidelines. And at that point, that'll probably take maybe the first half of the seminar or so. I'll stop, I'll ask for questions about the ways XC2 management can contribute in the guidelines themselves. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you some case studies and examples of different real-world processes of how you can implement these guidelines in practical ways of species conservation planning. So with that, I'm going to leave you visually, turn my camera off, and go to the PowerPoint presentation. So in this presentation, I want to talk about different kinds of ways you can do XC2 conservation assessments, but they're all based on using the IUCN XC2 guidelines. And as I'm sure all of you on this call know, species are under considerable and increasing threat. We have species moving closer to extinction every day. Changing categories on the IUCN Red List. And so it's even more urgent to do conservation planning and to look for all the conservation tools possible to help avoid these decreases in viability and risk of extinction. And when we think about species going extinct, we often think of lots of major threats that are causing this. You know, people will say, why is this species disappearing? And it might be issues related to habitat loss or invasive species. It could be emerging diseases or illegal trade. And for most species, it's usually more than one of these things, although there may be a primary driving factor. And often people are behind many of these causes. And so in our conservation toolkit, we have lots of different conservation strategies we often pull out. Again, we may not use one tool to help solve a conservation problem, but we may rely heavily on one or a couple of tools. And these tools are often designed to address those major threats that I was just mentioning. What I like to do here is to have you think about opening up that toolbox, digging down underneath in the bottom. Some of those tools you might forgot were in there, or you didn't even know they were there or what they were for, and realize that they might be useful too. They may not be the only tool you use, but they may be something that increases the effectiveness of all the tools in your toolbox. So in order for you to understand how XE2 conservation tools might fit in, I want to briefly walk through the process of how species often deteriorate in status and head towards extinction. And so often there are these primary major threats like habitat loss or illegal trade that eventually cause a population to decline. And if that decline continues, the population loses more habitat, for instance, then you may get small fragmented populations of this species rather than the once larger continuous distribution. Once that happens, a whole set of secondary threats start to increase, and these are often called stochastic threats. Just by chance, you may have a bunch of bad years, or a catastrophe might hit a population, or because it's small in size, inbreeding effects might start to build up. And as those effects build up, the population undergoes lower survival, lower reproduction, and often will decrease in size further, exacerbating those effects and causing even more reductions in reproduction and survival. And that can pull a population to what we call the extinction vortex, a feedback loop that can draw that population down to become extinct in the wild. If there are none in an XE2 situation, it can then lead to species extinction. And so often we have management actions that address those primary threats, and they're the ones we often think of in our conservation toolbox. But if we don't worry about what's going on in these stochastic processes to keep a population out of the extinction vortex, we might lose it before we can really alleviate those primary threats. On the other hand, if we only deal with populations by maybe, for instance, supplementing them continuously in the wild, and we don't deal with the primary threats, you'll always need to do this continuous reinforcement in order to have the population sustainable. And so often we need management actions along all these parts of this continuum to make sure we don't lose a population short term, but we also can maintain it long term in the wild. And so our conservation toolbox that deals with primary threats often deals with the upper part of this flow chart. XE2 activities can intercede anywhere along this flow, but they often deal more with the lower part of this chain towards extinction. So we know their XE2 management has contributed to the conservation of many species, and it's improved their status in the wild. And many of you may be familiar with many or all of these examples. But then what about some others? There are so many species out there, and the question often is XE2 management an appropriate choice to contribute towards the conservation of these species? So how do we decide that? Well, we found out in the past that the typical way we go about looking at in situ and XE2 populations isn't particularly the most effective way of doing it. Often we have field biologists, government wildlife managers, and other colleagues working in the wild developing recovery plans and strategies. And we have the zoo and aquarium associations developing their own master plans, their own collection plans. And sometimes as an afterthought, the two think about the other group of conservation colleagues and see if they have a role. And at CPSG, we've been promoting something we call the one plan approach, which is not a new idea. It's been around for decades and decades, but we're just trying to bring it a bit to the more forefront of having all stakeholders, both the in situ and XE2 communities, work together to develop one comprehensive plan, and with the goal being a viable population in the wild. And as part of that strategy, it might be that XE2 management is appropriate. In some cases, XE2 management is not appropriate. But to have both sides of the community consider these options as they're going through a conservation plan for a species. So the main tool here, if you're not familiar with these, is the IUCN SSC guidelines on the use of XC2 management for species conservation. These guidelines can be found in multiple languages, both on the IUCN website and also CPSG's website, and they outline a decision-making process that helps evaluate if XC2 activities or programs should be established for a species, and if so, what might the structure of those programs be to be most effective for conservation. The advantage to this process is it's transparent, it's a structured decision process, and even if the decision is not to involve XC2 management, you have a nice, well-documented decision process for that decision. They can be applied equally, whether this species is already in captivity or XC2 in any way, or if it's not being held. And it can apply to all taxa and living forms. So it's applicable to plants as well as animals, for example, and to frozen living tissue such as gametes, as well as to living animals. In the XC2 guidelines, there's a 5-step decision-making process, and I'm going to go into detail of these steps and explain how you might go about carrying them out. But in a nutshell, they involve looking at the current situation and threats, to look at potential options, evaluate those options, and then make a decision whether they are appropriate options for this species. So the first step in the process outlined in the XC2 guidelines is to review the threats to the species and its current status in the wild, and also any captive or XC2 populations for that species. So to look at in situ status, a first good place to look is the IUCN Red List. If that species has been assessed, there's a lot of information there on its status and threats. But you can go to other places too. If there are any current conservation strategies or action plans, you can look for publications particularly dealing with threats. Certainly go to the relevant specialist groups, including the taxon specialist group for that species. And there are many areas where you can get an idea of the status of that species and what's threatening its survival in the wild. You can also carry out a threat analysis. This is often done in species conservation planning, where you look in detail what's threatening a species, why that's happening, and explicitly how it's affecting the species, because that might help inform particularly XC2 management options. It's also useful to know the status of the species in captivity. For animal specimens that are managed by zoos or aquariums, going to the Regional Zoo or Aquarium Association is a great place to start. They have documents such as step books, species management plans, regional collection plans that are helpful. There are databases like the ZIMS database that is coordinated by the Species 360. Sometimes some of the data for XC2 facilities in some zoos or rescue centers or botanical gardens may require going to those facilities and doing a particular survey in an area. You can also check out seed banks and genome resource banks. And so there are many places you can go, but you may have to ask specifically in a region for information. So once you understand the situation in the wild and what's threatening the species, kind of the first part of that flow diagram I mentioned earlier, you can then start to look at, are there any potential XC2 conservation roles that could address some of those threats or constraints on the species' viability in the wild? So there are 4 different ways that XC2 activities might be able to help, and I'm going to give you some examples of each of these 4, but there's much more detail presented in the XC2 guidelines themselves. infrequent but potential way that XE2 could provide conservation benefit is to address the cause of the primary threats themselves. This might be through research, through specific of training of field techniques, or through education, something that helps reduce the threats or the impact of those threats. So for example, white nose syndrome is a disease in bats that is spreading across the eastern North American continent, and leads to very high mortality in some wild bat populations. By using XE2 populations, for example, at a university, research can be done to better understand the disease and understand ways to prevent or mitigate its effects. Another example using the same case with bats is to reduce the spread of disease. People are often asked to not go into caves, which is a recreational activity, or to use different kinds of quarantine or foot baths, things like that, to prevent the spread of disease. And so by having graphics and exhibits in a zoo, XE2 facilities in the area where this disease is occurring could help target changes in people's behavior to reduce the threat. And in cases like this, you wouldn't necessarily need to use an endangered species to get the message across, but a representative or surrogate member of the species. A second way that XE2 might be able to help is to address that link between small fragmented populations that are starting to experience stochastic effects and get pulled down into that extinction vortex. And so there may be ways to offset some of those stochastic effects. For example, Head Start programs, which are done, for example, with western pond turtles in western United States, are able to offset the high mortality experienced by the juvenile turtles in the wild. So we have an invasive species, bullfrogs, that eat small turtles and are causing poor recruitment. By bringing those young turtles into captivity, raising them to a larger age, and then putting them back out into the wild, we're able to mitigate or prevent the effects of the high mortality by this invasive species on these juveniles. Now, this means you do want to, of course, address the primary threat, but while bullfrogs are being controlled, you can also prevent the age pyramid by getting too unstable by keeping a lot of recruitment in the population. Note here, this is a case where there's releases into the wild, but there's no captive breeding needed to be able to do this type of program. Another example would be to reinforce wild populations. Mexican wolves in the United States is another example. This may be releasing adult animals, but there are also other techniques like cross-fostering captive-born pups into wild litters. Another way of thinking outside the box of how an XE2 population can supplement a wild population, both demographically by adding animals and balancing sex ratios, and genetically by bringing new genetics into the wild. So a third way that XE2 populations can start to break that link where a population in the wild is going downhill and it's in danger of becoming extinct in the wild. So for example, with whooping cranes, there was one wild population left in existence, but XE2 captive breeding, using XE2 birds for head starting, and then reintroducing these birds into new habitat are ways of establishing second, third, additional reintroduced populations and restoring some of the range of that species. The ultimate poster child for this perhaps is the Arabian oryx that did go extinct in the wild, was spread extensively in zoos and private reserves, and reintroduced back to the wild. It's now jumped 3 categories on the IUCN Red List and has really, due to captive breeding and release, been able to reestablish that species in the wild. And the fourth way that XE2 management can contribute to conservation is, of course, species such as the Arabian oryx, where they had gone extinct in the wild, but they prevent species extinction and hopefully will provide a source for reestablishment in the wild. So often zoos think of their long-term captive breeding programs that are genetically managed as insurance populations that help preserve species genetic diversity, taking from a diversity of wild-caught animals. They're an insurance policy against extinction in the wild. And if you have an insurance population, it might also have the potential to be used for some of these other purposes that I've described earlier. An insurance population can be a cryopreserved frozen zoo or gamete bank, as well as a living population. You can also have rescue populations when you see an emerging threat that's quickly moving through the wild. Often these are diseases such as devil facial tumor disease that spread through Tasmania and was dramatically affecting Tasmanian devils. Other examples would be the chytrid fungus that's moving through amphibian populations. An ARC population is almost the extreme of this, where the species has disappeared in the wild. It's the last remnants of the species that can then be used to reestablish the population. And until recently, the Kenhansi spray toad fell into this category when the mist around the falls was its obligate habitat disappeared. The remaining members of the species were brought into captivity and bred, and then as that habitat was recreated in the wild, it now has been used for a source population to reestablish the species. So in the 5-step decision process of the XE2 guidelines, you understand the problem, you look at all the ways XE2 might be able to help, and of course in concert with any other conservation strategies as well. And then you need to think about, for each one of those roles, if you were really going to do it, what would you need to be successful? How would that program need to look? And so, for example, you need to think about things such as, is this going to be a regional program or international? Will the specimens be on public display, or do they need to be off, away from people? How big does the population need to be, and how does it need to be managed? How many facilities will be involved, and what kind of husbandry expertise do you need? So all these kinds of characteristics will be very different depending on the purpose and goal of that particular population. Sometimes there are modeling tools that can help you define those characteristics. A notable one is PMX. That is often used for zoo populations. It's one of the software packages available from the Species Conservation Toolkit initiative. You'll see the website address there for that. And it's now being modified to be used for genome resource banks and for plants as well. And so this is a tool to help you design the kind of program you need to meet those goals. Another tool would be a software modeling program, a population program such as Vortex is another example from SCTI, because it helps you figure out what's the long-term viability under different conditions. So what's likely to happen to the species in the wild if you don't do anything, and what is it likely to be if you do various management actions, including XE2 management. And you can use that to help determine, for instance, how many animals would you need to release over what schedule to really build up a viable population in the wild. So now that you know what you would need to do those particular programs to meet its particular role, you also need to look at, okay, is this feasible? And what would it take? What resources would I need? And again, in the XE2 guidelines, there's much more detail in this, but you need to think about the biological feasibility of being able to do that program, the social feasibility, looking at different legislation and stakeholder issues, for example. Are the resources available? And all those wrap together to give you an understanding of what's the likelihood that you could actually succeed doing this program. You also want to look at any risk of doing the program. So, for instance, if you need to take animals from the wild, what's the risk to the wild population? What's the risk to the recipient population if you're transferring animals? Are there disease risk? Are there political or social risk or conflicts of interest? And be sure to include in that assessment what's the risk of not doing an XE2 activity? What's the likely future for the population with and without this type of intervention? And so once that assessment's been done, the fifth step in the XE2 guidelines is to make the decision based on all of that information. And the decision is, should an XE2 activity be established? And if so, for what purpose and how should it be structured? So using all of the information that came before this, you're really trying to weigh the conservation benefits of a particular activity versus the feasibility of doing it, any risk associated with doing it. There's no magic formula to this because it will really depend upon the stakeholder group doing the evaluation and how important it is that particular taxa is to that group. In general, though, you're looking for instances where the conservation benefits outweigh the risk, and hopefully the risk and risk are low, feasibility is high, and conservation benefits are high. In order to figure that out, again, sometimes modeling tools can help you quantify some of those decisions. They're not necessary, and they're not always helpful, but in some cases, they can help you evaluate how to strike that balance. So at this point, I've gone through how XE2 options might help conservation, and I've gone through the decision process of the guidelines. But before I go on to examples of how to implement that, I'd like to see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Kathy. So if you do have any questions, please just write them in the chat box just now, and then we can queue them up. Just whilst you're having a think about that, Kathy, some people listening in here are on the online course, and within that course, we're describing a sort of a generic, broad species conservation workshop planning process to develop recommendations to develop a plan for the conservation of a species. In terms of ordering of events, and thinking about when one might apply the ex situ guidelines, would you imagine, there is this broad plan that's developed that might highlight either a question mark or specifically say, we need to think about ex situ, and then there's a further process that then goes on to apply these guidelines, which is really drilling into the ex situ side? Or would you say this is a process that is an alternative to that broader species conservation planning event?
Well, that's a great question. And it leads into actually the next part of my talk, because I'll show some examples of how to implement this. But in a nutshell, what I would say up front is I think in an ideal world, it would all be done at the same time. And so in order to do an XE2 assessment like I just described, in the best case, you need a thorough threats assessment, which is often done in a more generic species conservation planning process. And in the more generic process, you're going through the same decision process of looking at what are the threats, what are the problems, what are the potential strategies to address them, and evaluating those strategies and making a decision. And I think ideally you would throw XE2 management options in that mix as one of the many tools that you would assess during a species conservation planning process. I would also say in both cases, whether or not you're doing this explicitly, it really benefits to have both the in situ and ex situ species experts in the room in all of these evaluations. So whether it's a generic, for CPSG, it's a PHVA, but there are other kinds of species workshops. Or if you're doing something that's focused primarily on ex situ, you still need people that understand the situation in the wild, the threats, what's feasible and what's not in both in situ and ex situ environments.
Thanks very much, Kathy. And you mentioned PHVA there. So for those of you not sure, that's population and habitat viability analysis. I always get confused between analysis and assessment. Assessment. Thank you very much. So don't ask me, I'm just going to confuse you further. There are a few other questions. So Ben had one. So is there any support available to help use the software tools for population models? And I can say that, if it's helpful, I can pass you an email, but as Kathy mentioned, SCTI, go and check out their website and contact them. They do provide training. We also provide training around some of the tools such as Vortex for PVA work. So I'm very happy to talk about that offline. Kathy, I don't know whether you would add anything to that.
Yeah, I would say both of I think the two primary pieces of software are the two I mentioned, PMX and Vortex. They both have extensive manuals. On the website, you can download the software tools and the manuals for free. And that said, I would also say they require a fair amount of expertise to use them properly. So if you are looking at PMX, the regional zoo associations, many of them offer their own training as well. And then SCTI, in addition to training courses, also has a helpline for each one of those pieces of software. So contacting them, they could help you.
Thanks very much. And Jose has asked, I think, again, this is a question that you'll respond to afterwards in the later part of the talk, but he's asking about, would it be possible to see real examples of all this process done in the past with the species? But as I say, I think that's probably what we're going to come to next. Karen was asking, how might the process differ if there is already an ex situ program established?
That's a good question. When you get into evaluating the role, so if you already know you have an ex situ program, it may not be currently situated for a particular role. So then when you get into step 3 of how the program needs to be structured, you would think, compared to how it's structured now, how might that structure be expanded or changed to meet additional roles? Maybe it needs additional attention. Maybe it's perfectly structured as it is right now. Maybe it is structured now as an insurance population that is well maintained, but with some additional work, it also could become a research population, for example. And then when you get down to the feasibility part, if you had the same species and the same needs and the same potential roles, it may be a lot more feasible if you already have the species, you have some in captivity already, you have some expertise, you have some facilities on board, and it may be just a little bit of extra resources or attention could provide a lot of benefit. Whereas if you're starting from scratch, feasibility might be a lot lower.
And there's just 2 more questions just now. So Karen is asking, can you address the importance of ex situ personnel working with specialist groups in situ and ex situ, with specialist group members in the process? So the importance of ex situ and in situ working with the specialist groups.
I think that's really important. I think in the past that's really varied. There have been some SSC specialist groups that have worked extensively with ex situ. For example, the Asian wild cattle specialist group works quite a bit with the regional zoo associations with the tags. The Canid specialist group's been working with them recently, and there are other examples. I'll give some coming up, but it's part of what we were calling the one plan approach, that in order for in situ specialists to do the very best conservation. We're urging them to dig down in the bottom of that toolbox and to look at all the tools that might be helpful. Even if XE2 management itself is not particularly useful, it could be that XE2 experts have the knowledge of the species, firsthand, that they literally have hands-on day-to-day, that might be able to inform field work. They may be able to provide expertise and communication to work with local stakeholders. They may, there are many contributions the XE2 community can do, both in knowledge and resources to help in situ conservation. And I think on the other side, XE2 managers need to make sure they're well grounded in the needs of their species in the wild. And so having those specialist groups and other field people in the XE2 discussions and on their committees as well is quite important to make sure they are grounded in the real needs of the species. And so a lot of the steering committees or other kinds of management committees on both sides here often have representatives from the other community to help make that link.
Thanks, Kathy. Let's carry on.
Okay, great. Well, great question so far. Now I'm looking forward to showing you a few examples right here. So the question is, how do we bring these two groups of people together, and how can we apply those guidelines in the real world? Essentially, how can we do everything that I was just discussing? So in response to the question Jamie asked, one way to do it is to do this as part of a species conservation planning workshop. And an example here was a couple of years ago, there was a PHVA, Population and Habitat Viability Assessment for the harpy eagle in Brazil. And in that workshop, as we do with all conservation planning workshops, we had several different working groups. One working group was looking at population biology issues and monitoring and research and so forth. Another group was looking at habitat-related issues. And there was a third group that was specifically looking at XE2 management. They listened to all the threats and all the conservation strategies being discussed in the other groups during the plenary sessions. And in their group, they had in situ and XE2 experts looking at what are the potential roles for XE2 management for harpy eagles. And they spent several days of working group time in detail, walking through those XE2 guidelines for this species and making very committed and smart recommendations at the end of what should be done, who's going to do it, when they're going to do it, and how it will occur. So this fit in as a working group as it would any other kind of topic that would come up in a conservation planning workshop. This really helps because you can see what else is being recommended and you can fit all these conservation strategies together in a really nice holistic one-plan approach. But you can't, that doesn't always happen. Perhaps that strategy already exists, for example. So you can do this assessment as its own independent workshop. This is one that CPSG did with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and with the Minnesota Zoo and also with the Nature Conservancy. And so we had in situ and ex situ experts there. They already had conservation plans for these two endangered prairie butterflies for the wild, but they were in highly fragmented, isolated populations in the wild in trouble. And so they were interested if ex situ management might have a role. So in that workshop, we essentially walked through the 5 steps of the XE2 guidelines. We still did threatedness assessments. We looked at potential roles, we evaluated them, and they came up with decisions. And I want to point out, this was the 5-year plan that was made for one of those endangered butterfly species. And I won't go into detail, but you can see the little numbers. Those are really steps. It's a consecutive plan that builds upon itself. Because in the beginning, there was not enough expertise to do a captive breeding program to either have an insurance population or as a source for release. And so, but they can do head starting of raising eggs through caterpillars up to the adult stage. So they were starting slow and using a surrogate species to learn more about captive breeding before going to the more endangered species and applying those techniques. If and when that expertise develops, they can go on to do some specific population-specific disease and parasite research that would then enable them to collect and store and maintain insurance populations that can be used to reinforce existing populations in the wild and to establish new reintroduced populations. They also realized they might need a contingency emergency plan, that if one of these small patches of butterfly prairie was going to be lost, that they could go in and have a rescue plan already in place. And so the points here is, if feasibility is low for a particular role, you may be able to build a program that builds upon itself with different roles emerging over time. And by the way, this report and several of the others I mentioned, at least that CPSG was involved in, could be found on our CPSG website. A recent workshop we did last December in Brazil was to look at 7 species of Amazon parrots and a parakeet that again were under risk in the wild. And so this was I said 2 days, but actually this was a 4-day workshop. That's a misprint on the slide. But we spent 4 days looking at 7 species. And so that's a little different than spending, say, 3 days on one in a conservation planning workshop. It's less time. It's maybe about a half a day per species. But we were able to do this because these were all related taxa with related threats. And so we grouped them together. We did a threat analysis. That's that flow diagram on the right. We looked at all the different things going on in the wild. We could come up with potential roles, conservation roles for XE2 management that were similar but not identical for all 7 species. And then once we kind of look at the whole situation in general, we could spend about a half a day walking through each species and talking about its specific problems, its specific status and husbandry expertise in captivity, and to make recommendations of which roles were appropriate for which of those 7 species. And so lots of discussions and flip charts later. We had an XE2 plan for each of the 7 species. This ends up, when you do it this way, you're doing more species, shorter amount of time per species. And so we really spend a lot of the time doing the assessment and figuring out what's the appropriate thing to do. And there's less time to get into the details of making the plan of, now that we have the recommendation, how are we going to do it? Who's going to do it? What are our timelines and next steps? And that's something you sacrifice when you start doing many species and spending less time on each. You often can do a thorough assessment, but you do less of the planning of how to move forward next. That might need its own next workshop. And kind of taking that idea to kind of extreme is a new process that we call ICAP. It's the Integrated Collection, Assessment, and Planning process. CPSG developed this process jointly with regional zoo associations, primarily IAZA in Europe, AZA in North America, and ZA in Australasia. And it's meant to be a multi-species rapid XE2 conservation assessment. So we apply the steps of the guidelines, but we apply them very quickly for a group of species, often a collection of species that are managed under one heading in zoos and aquariums. And so this helps zoos, for example, with setting their priorities for regional collection planning. We rolled this out about 3 years ago with the first workshop, and we looked at all of the canid species and hyaenid species in the world. So that was 43 taxa, and we went through 43 taxa in 2 days, going through essentially the steps of the XC2 guidelines. This involved, it was done in the cooperation with the canid specialist group and the hyena specialist group, and with 7 zoo associations around the world holding these species. And as you can guess, that's a lot to fit in for 2 days. So it involves a lot of pre-workshop prep to do this. We create species sheets that summarize the threats in the wild and the situation both in situ and ex situ in the wild. We summarize what prior ex situ recommendations have been, so we understand the current status. And we bring all that information to the discussion beforehand. It's important, or when possible, it's important to look at all the species in this category. So we didn't look at just the canid and hyaenid species that were in zoos, but we took them whether they were there or not, because maybe they're there and they don't need to be. Maybe there are some missing that should be there. So we want to look at all of them, and we want to look at whether they were threatened or not in an ideal world. Maybe some haven't been classified as threatened on the red list, but in reality, when you talk to the field experts, they are in trouble. There are some that maybe they themselves don't necessarily need XC2 management, but they would be excellent surrogates to use to benefit a more endangered species that you might not want to bring into captivity. And so in an ideal situation, I would look at all of the related taxa. Get all the information we can from all the data sources I listed earlier in this presentation and from expert surveys. And so this particular ICAP, the report, is on our CPSG website, and you can see that prior to the workshop, there were some in situ specialists that could not be there. We had some there, but it's hard to get field people for all 43 species together at that workshop. So we did some very carefully worded surveys of those in situ experts to find out how they would see ex situ potentially fitting into the conservation forest species. All of this information, both these data sheets and the results of those surveys, were the fodder for our discussion at an actual workshop. So we did the workshop in 2 days, again, for those species, and we walked through those 5 steps of the XC2 guidelines. We expanded it just a bit for this particular purpose. We also allowed the discussion of non-conservation roles, understanding that zoos occasionally have species that might be very important for other reasons, and we want to make sure we documented those as well. And we also talked a little bit about both direct and indirect conservation roles. Direct conservation being the most important, but there might be cases where indirect conservation could be an additional role, for instance, through graphics and public awareness and education for those zoo exhibits, or contributing resources and expertise to in situ conservation efforts. But these would be ones where you wouldn't necessarily need the species directly in captivity to make those contributions. So in order to do 43 species in 2 days, we were fast and furious. Lots of pieces of flip chart paper quickly accumulated around the room. And we do a lot of quick assessments of what's the relative benefit, feasibility, and risk for various potential roles, and rate those high, medium, or low, noting any regional or global important differences, and coming up with some recommendations. And every time we've done this, it starts a little slow as people get used to the process, and then you tend to pick up speed, and people see where it's all heading and cut to the chase. And so we come up in the report with recommendations. Again, in this case, talking about dole, in a discussion, 20-minute discussion, we may do a lot of evaluation and the first cut at what would be the areas of high priority. And then these results would be advisory to go to the regional zoo associations, to the specialist groups, and to any other in situ conservation managers for their incorporation as they see fit. The European Association of Zoos and Aquariums, IAZA, has now adopted this process. They use the ICAP type process for their regional collection planning. They have a whole new structure for their XC2 programs. And last year they did 6 of these new style RCPs, or regional collection plans, and they have 8 more planned for this year. And one example was one that I helped facilitate. We looked at 150 taxa of Asian songbirds that are impacted by trade in 2 days. In order to do that successfully, you need highly knowledgeable experts in the room on both in situ and ex situ status and challenges, which we did, and got a lot of progress done in 2 days. We've also taken this on an institutional level. We've run a couple of ICAPs with the Taipei Zoo last year. And for example, they have a large rescue center, and they have 62 different turtle species that have been confiscated. And we want to look at, were there conservation relevant roles for those collections? Some of those were a few animals, some were hundreds of animals. And how could those collections be used for conservation benefit? There was a second one run on various species from Taiwan as well, and it gave their zoo a way to focus the conservation benefits of the species in their collections. So in summary, I've outlined 4 different ways, and there are more. These are the ways we've used so far, how to actually implement the XC2 guidelines. You can make it an explicit component of a comprehensive species conservation planning process, like a PHVA or a similar type of conservation plan. You could make it an independent process that just looks at XC2 feasibility, but you would want to integrate it with any other conservation planning that was done. You could do a multi-species assessment for just a few related taxa that have a similar threat and situation. And maybe, depending on your time, you might go into less detailed planning of how you would actually implement those programs. And then you could do a much larger multi-species rapid assessment, doing the rapid assessment and just some general planning of which way to move forward. And this would be the ICAP model that primarily aids XC2 organizations like botanical gardens and regional zoo associations in their collection planning. We had one that just happened last week that was looking at ornamental plants in botanical gardens and garden centers in Costa Rica, and the conservation and the ecological benefits of those plants. And so you can expand and modify this process to whatever taxa and whatever situation best fits. The 2 common components of all of these different ways to implement this is to use the general 5 steps in the XC2 guidelines for the use of XC2 management for species conservation, and then also to have multiple stakeholder involvement, and specifically here experts from both the in-situ and XC2 communities contributing to how XC2 might play a potential role, how feasible that is, and what is the right way to move forward. So with that, we're almost out of time. I'll take a break and see if there's any additional questions.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Whilst if people want to add their questions onto the chat box, or they can also, it may be a bit chaotic, we'll see how it goes. You can also turn your mic on, but please don't speak just now, and I'll just have a look and try and queue them up. There are a couple of questions already. Kate was just asking, can you tell us where you see people most often running into difficulties with the process or getting things wrong?
Hmm. The process itself, collecting the material beforehand, if you're doing a multi-species assessment, that can be a much larger task than people realize. Um, Another challenge is to get both both types of expertise in the room. So making sure you can get both the NC2 and XC2 experts there. And one of the things they might do wrong is, I'd say in general, people tend to think when you say XC2, they think long-term captive breeding program. And so we try to get people to realize that that is a valid role, but there are also other ways that XC2 can benefit wild species, and so try to get people to think more broadly.
And Peter was asking more about the multi-species conservation planning, and would it be feasible or useful for species that don't necessarily belong to the same taxon, but rather share the same habitat, or perhaps some other way of grouping them up, such as threat? They would share common threats and maybe solutions. So have you thought about how one can do it beyond a sort of a taxonomic group, more of a threat-based or a conservation needs grouping, or does the process not really work so well with that?
Yeah, I think I think that's possible. I think we're still thinking about that a bit. One reason we went with a similar taxon is because they often in zoos occupy similar space, and they almost compete with each other for the same space, and they may also include similar husbandry issues. And so often, if you're going to really devote a lot of space, say, to one large cat, like a tiger or a jaguar, it may mean you have less space for leopards or lions or cheetahs. And so that's one reason to look at it that way. Another is often XE2 contributions are looking at the population level. Are you doing head starting, or are you reinforcing wild populations? And so if you're looking at really different taxa, those might be really different considerations. If, however, you're able to look at ways to reduce the threat, then I think looking threat-based, would work in that case. So happy to think and chat more about that, because that's certainly something we're looking at for other kinds of multi-species conservation planning.
And Jacqueline was wondering about whether you'd consider, this interesting way, if you consider individuals in the commercial fishing industry to fall into the one plan approach category, if they'd be willing to attend relevant planning workshops. So is there a role for them to play in this?
Yeah, I think that's a good question too, because we do want to think outside of, zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, but all kinds of XC2 situations. Certainly things like rescue centers and rehab centers have already been included in this process. When you get to commercial fisheries, I think there are some roles there, and if you could have them participate, I think that's great. I think sometimes they may have different goals, and so, for instance, the way species are managed in some commercial industries might not have the same type of demographic or genetic management we may be looking for, but in some cases it may fit in quite well with what needs to be done. And so I think it would be great to involve all those kinds of people. They have expertise, they have resources, and if common goals can be found and techniques aligned, I think that would be great.
And there's we've got one more question and a couple of comments that we'll finish off with. Bahar is just asking what the survival rate of released captive bred populations in the wild is, or can you give a few examples? I imagine that's going to vary in both with the species and the process they actually used as to what that survival rate is. I imagine this goes beyond really the application of the guidelines itself. Do you have a view on that?
Right. I guess I would say it does vary widely, and it's also varied over time as people have learned how to do that with some taxa that's improved not only releases for that taxa but also similar taxa. But I would say this topic really falls into a whole nother set of guidelines that IUCN has, and there is a set of guidelines for reintroduction and conservation translocations. And so if a group of people were looking at the XC2 guidelines in any kind of conservation planning process, and they're considering something that might lead to releases, I would strongly urge them to look at those guidelines as well, that do consider some of those types of issues. And for instance, with the butterfly workshop that I mentioned here, we actually used both sets of guidelines in that evaluation. So I think it really is highly variable.
Thanks, Kathy, for that. And just finishing with a couple of comments. Karen was just mentioning that additional tools are available, such as the IUCN Wildlife Disease Risk Assessment process that can help with knowledge on threats and status in the wild. And that's something we talked about at our last meeting in Bangkok, about how we use wildlife disease risk assessment processes for multi-species health analysis. So perhaps there's an indication there about a future webinar as well. And I'm talking with Richard Jacoboff, who's involved in the development of those guidelines very heavily, about developing a training course that would be looking at how you apply those guidelines. And that's something that Kathy and I, I'm sure, will be talking about later on this year as well. Josh also flagged up that PMX updates are coming soon, so check on the SCTI website for updates in the coming weeks. And if anybody, Jose's pointed out that they're interested in, hosting workshops to apply these guidelines to taxonomic groups. And obviously, if you are interested, then please do contact us and contact Kathy or myself, and we can make the appropriate links and see what is possible. And just ending with, because I see we're over time, but Jessica, for the success of small populations such as ex situ, a lot of collaboration between institutions is required. Can we improve? This is not a great one to end on because it's massive. It's a great question. It's a massive one. But how do we improve on that collaboration? And Jessica, I'd probably say, you're on the course, I think, anyway. So hopefully you're going to learn something from that. And it's definitely an area we need to be thinking more about. Kathy, can you, in a nutshell, say how we can help improve collaborations between institutions?
I think it's between institutions and also between organizations, and I think it's hard because there's been a dichotomy between kind of the NC2 and XC2 world for a while, and not a little bit of distrust between the two in some cases. But I really see a lot of progress. At least the zoo and aquarium community has really come on board with this, and I think they're more open to bringing in situ experts. So I would say things like tags, taxon advisory groups, and species survival plans and other management groups, bringing on advisors and board members that have in situ connections is great. On the other side of the fence, trying to get to the in situ community and the wildlife managers and explain that XC2 may potentially have a role is sometimes a little bit more difficult sell. But we found in some of the ICAPs that we've run, I've seen in situ project managers coming in quite skeptical and walking out being thrilled with what they found out might be able to be done, and being very positive. Even the ones that we've done the surveys to that couldn't attend the workshops, would first come back with, I'm not quite sure why you're asking, and then by the time they get into it, they go, I can't believe that you're really looking at all these different options and how they can help, and I think this is wonderful. And so I think hopefully going through a proper evaluative approach and not just saying yes or no, captive breeding can help, will help bring these two worlds together.
A great way to end, Kathy. Thank you so much for that. Paul has flagged up a link to reintroduction perspectives if you want to find out more about case studies from different translocation projects. And we're actually looking at developing our own publication that will look more at the planning process. So kind of watch that space on that. Thank you all for listening. I hope you're interested in signing up to other webinars that we have in this series. I am recording this. I'll get it uploaded and I'll send around a link for those people who want to have a recording of it later. And Kathy in particular, thank you so much for giving us such an informative and slick presentation.
Great, thanks everyone. And if you have colleagues that couldn't make it today, we've got another session in a couple of days. So thank you.